Her cruel husband left her to die in the blistering desert, the venom of a rattlesnake already coursing through her veins. He took the last of the water, stole the locket her mother gave her, and vanished into the horizon without a backward glance. She lay in the dust, ankle-swollen, breath shallow, praying for a miracle as the sun beat down like a merciless judge. This is the story of betrayal, survival, and the unexpected hand of kindness that would change everything. Follow my story until the very end, and don't forget comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story has traveled across the world. The year was 1884, and the Arizona sun was not just hot, it was punishing. It scorched the ground until the earth cracked, until the air shimmered in waves that made the horizon blur and dance. For Eleanor Hayes, that endless horizon had become a prison wall. Every direction looked the same dust, rock, and sky, and every step forward promised only more suffering. Her husband, Silas Vance, trudged ahead of her, his boots crunching over the brittle earth. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, and sunburnt red along the neck where his shirt collar sagged. His presence used to mean strength to Eleanor. Once long ago, she had believed in him, trusted that his boldness could carry them through the harshness of the frontier. Now she saw only cruelty in his slitted eyes, only selfishness in the way he gulped from the water canteen before tossing it back onto the wagon bench without so much as offering her a sip. Their wagon sat crippled behind them, axle snapped like an old bone. The horse had gone lame weeks before, reduced to nothing more than a burdened shadow of its once strong self. Their dream of carving out a fortune in Prescott had turned to dust just as surely as the road beneath their feet. And Silas, unable to face his own failure, turned his fury on her. Useless, he muttered under his breath, his boot lashing out to kick the wheel of the wagon. The word was meant for her. Eleanor stood with her hands clasped tightly before her, her faded calico dress clinging to her damp skin. Her lips were cracked, her throat raw from thirst. She longed for just one full mouthful of water. But Silas had rationed her to nothing more than a swallow. Now and then barely enough to wet her tongue, never enough to quench the ache in her chest. She watched the sun beating down on the earth, and in the silence dared to imagine freedom. Freedom from the man who dragged her through this wasteland. Freedom from his endless contempt. Silas's voice snapped her out of the thought. Don't just stand there like a fool. Go fetch some brush for a fire. Not that there's anything left to cook. Her stomach twisted. The last of their dried meat was gone. Hunger joined thirst, a relentless pair gnawing at her insides. But she obeyed because disobedience meant anger, and anger meant bruises. She turned and walked toward a scattering of mesquite and brittle bush a short distance from the wagon. The ground radiated heat through the thin soles of her boots, and the silence pressed in heavy around her. Kneeling, she reached for a branch. That was when she saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a shimmer in the corner of her eye, a ripple in the dust. Then came the sound, the dry rattle, unmistakable like beans shaken in a hollow gourd. Before she could recoil, the strike came fast, a blur of scales and muscle. Pain lanced through her ankle, sharp and burning, as if 2 needles of fire had been driven deep into her flesh. She cried out, stumbling backward and collapsing hard against the earth. Her hands flew to her leg, clutching where the searing pain radiated upward in violent pulses. She saw the rattlesnake retreat, its diamond-patterned body slipping back beneath the shade of a rock, the rattle buzzing once more before silence reclaimed the desert. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She stared at the twin puncture wounds already welling with thin fluid. Panic gripped her chest like a fist. Silas! She screamed, her voice raw and desperate. Silas, help me! He came striding over, but instead of urgency, his face was carved with annoyance. What now, woman? Seen a ghost? Her voice shook as she pointed. A snake. It bit me. He stopped beside her, gaze dropping to her ankle. For a long, terrible moment, he said nothing. Eleanor searched his expression for concern, for pity, for anything human. Instead, his eyes narrowed with a calculating coldness she had never seen before. A rattler, he asked at last. His tone was strangely calm. Yes, she whispered, tears cutting lines down her dusty cheeks. Please, Silas, you have to help me. Cut it. Suck the poison out, something. For a moment she thought she saw him bend. He crouched beside her, his hand brushing her apron pocket. But instead of reaching for her wound, his fingers slipped inside and drew out the small silver locket her mother had given her. He weighed it in his palm, then slipped it into his pocket. Eleanor's stomach turned cold. "What are you doing?" Silas stood dusting off his knees, his lips twisted into a cruel smile. "You've been nothing but a curse since the day I married you. Bad luck follows you like a shadow. Maybe this land's telling me it's time to be free." "No," she gasped, trying to pull herself up. "You can't." But he was already striding away. He grabbed the last canteen, the small sack of coins, and without a backward glance began walking east across the open plain. "Silas!" She screamed, her voice tearing at her throat. "Don't leave me, please!" He didn't falter. His figure grew smaller and smaller, swallowed by the shimmering horizon, until he was nothing but a speck against the sky, and then gone. The silence that followed was worse than his cruelty. Eleanor collapsed back into the dust, the heat pressing down her pulse, thundering in her ears, the venom already searing its way up her leg. Her heart hammered, her breath hitched, and the desert held its breath. She was alone, left to die. Amos Blackthorne had not planned on riding so far south that day. He had set out at dawn, the reins of his horse loose in his calloused hand, following a calf that had strayed from the herd. It wasn't unusual for Amos to spend whole days in the saddle scanning the parched horizon. Solitude was his closest companion. For 5 long years since consumption had taken Martha, silence had been his anchor. He moved with the land's rhythm, steady and predictable, fixing fences, checking wells, tending to cattle. But that morning something restless stirred in him. Maybe it was the hawk he'd seen circling low, its cry echoing across the canyons. Maybe it was the heavy heat pressing down on him harder than usual, a kind of omen in the air. Whatever it was, Amos rode further than he intended down along the southern edge of his property, where pallow trees threw ragged shadows over the dust. At first he thought it was a bundle of old cloth, maybe a discarded tarp collapsed under a tree. But as his horse drew nearer, he saw the unmistakable outline of a human body. He slowed, suspicion pricking at the back of his neck. Bandits sometimes used decoys, a crumpled figure, to lure in the unsuspecting. His hand hovered near the Colt Peacemaker on his hip as he dismounted, boots crunching in the grit. The closer he came, the more wrong the scene looked. It wasn't the loose sprawl of a drunk or the lifeless slump of a corpse. It was something in between. It was a woman. Her face was pale beneath the streaks of dust lips tinged an awful shade of blue. One arm lay flung across her eyes as if she had tried to shield herself from the pitiless sun and failed. Amos crouched, lifting her arm gently aside, and his breath caught. Her skin was clammy, her breathing shallow, as if each breath was a battle she was losing. His eyes traveled down her body, and what he saw made his stomach tighten with urgency. Her left leg was grotesquely swollen skin, stretched and discolored purple and angry. Just above her ankle, 2 dark puncture marks gleamed like a brand, the signature of a rattlesnake. "Damn," Amos muttered under his breath, voice low. For a man who had built his life on routines, on stillness, the surge that gripped him now was jarring. Protective fury at the snake, at the cruel land, at whoever had abandoned her here. There was no time for second-guessing. He knew the old remedies, half prayers, half desperation, but they were all he had. He pulled the Bowie knife from its sheath, the steel cool and familiar in his palm. Kneeling beside her, he whispered, "Forgive me, miss." It might have been meant for her. It might have been meant for Martha, watching from whatever heaven had taken her. He made 2 quick, shallow cuts across the bite. Then, pressing his mouth to her skin, he drew the venom-tainted blood, spitting it out onto the dirt. The taste was vile, metallic, and acrid, the bitterness clinging to his tongue. Again and again he sucked and spat, each time his chest heaving harder. He worked until his own head swam, until the phantom taste of poison lingered long after there was nothing left to draw. Finally, Amos pulled back, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He unscrewed his canteen and rinsed, then tipped a few precious drops onto her cracked lips. For a moment, nothing. Then a faint moan escaped her throat, fragile but alive. "That's it," he murmured, voice softer than he knew it could be. "Stay with me." Her eyelids fluttered, but she did not wake. He gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, fragile as a child, yet the burden felt heavier than any he had carried in years. Lifting her onto his horse, he settled her against his chest, her head lolling against the worn fabric of his shirt. The horse snorted, sensing the urgency in his grip. Amos swung into the saddle, one arm securing the woman close, the other clutching the reins. He spurred the horse hard, turning its nose north toward the shadow of his cabin on the horizon. The sun was dipping westward, the sky bleeding into evening, but Amos knew the race he rode now was not against daylight. It was against death itself. The horse's hooves thundered across the ground, carrying them over cracked earth and sparse brush. Every so often, Amos glanced down at her face. She was caught in a fever dream, her lips moving, whispering fragments he could not understand. The name Silas came once sharp and pained, and Amos felt his jaw tighten. Whoever Silas was, Amos already hated him. By the time the cabin came into sight, small and weathered, tucked against the slope of a hill, Amos's arms ached from holding her upright, his throat dry from the venom's bitterness. But he did not slow. He rode straight into the yard, slid off the horse with her still cradled in his arms, and kicked the door open. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and old earth. Amos laid her gently on the cot in the corner, the same one Martha had once slept in, and for the first time in 5 years he felt that room breathe with life again. Her chest rose and fell in shallow waves, but it was enough. She was alive. And Amos, whose life had been nothing but silence for half a decade, whispered to her as he fetched water, herbs, and bandages. "You're safe now," he said. "I'll see to it." But even as he spoke, he knew safety was a fragile word in the desert. The real battle was just beginning. The desert fever did not loosen its grip easily. That night, Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness, her body caught in a storm that she could not escape. She tossed beneath the rough wool blanket Amos had pulled over her, her brow glistening with sweat. Her lips cracked, words spilling from them in half-coherent murmurs. Amos sat beside her cot, a bowl of cool water at his feet, a cloth in his hand. Every time she moaned, he wrung the cloth out and laid it across her forehead. Her skin burned like fire, yet her hands were icy cold when he brushed them. He had seen sickness before, watched Martha's lungs weaken. Her breath rattle until silence claimed her, but this was different. This was poison running its course, swift and merciless. "Hold on," he muttered, as if sheer stubbornness could anchor her spirit in her body. "Don't let go now." Her fevered rambling filled the small cabin. She spoke of a wagon, of broken wheels, of a man's voice sharp with scorn. "Silas," she whispered over and over. "Don't leave me." The words clawed at Amos's chest. He leaned closer, studying her pale, sweat-slick face. Whoever this Silas was, Amos understood one thing: he had not been here when she needed him. When her cries grew more frantic, Amos lit a lamp, casting a golden glow across the cabin's rough timbers. He brewed willow bark tea the way Martha had once taught him, crushing the bitter bark and steeping it until the water darkened. He coaxed a few drops between Eleanor's lips. Some dribbled down her chin, but some made it into her mouth, and her throat worked weakly to swallow. Through the long hours, Amos kept vigil. He changed the poultices on her swollen leg, replacing them with fresh mash of herbs he gathered from Martha's old garden patch. He poured water over her wound to ease the heat rising from it. His own body ached, shoulders stiff, eyes heavy, but he refused to close them. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers by the time Eleanor quieted. For a brief spell, her breathing smoothed her body still. Amos sat back, weary relief washing over him. He looked around the cabin, the shelves lined with jars. Martha had once filled the rocking chair she used to sit in by the window, the quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. For 5 years, all these things had been relics, reminders of a life that had ended too soon. But now, with this stranger lying in Martha's place, it was as if the cabin itself stirred from its long sleep. Amos found himself whispering Martha, "I don't know what you'd say to this, but I couldn't leave her. You'd have wanted me to try." A sound broke his reverie. Eleanor thrashed suddenly, her hands clutching at the blanket. Her eyes opened for a fleeting second, glazed and wild, and she cried out, "Snake, Silas, don't please." Her voice cracked into sobs. Amos leaned forward, gripping her shoulders gently. "Hush now," he said firmly, his deep voice cutting through her terror. "It's not here. You're safe. Do you hear me safe?" Her head rolled weakly toward him, eyes half shut. A tear slipped down her cheek, tracing a line through the dirt. Then her breathing slowed again, uneven but calmer. The hours crawled by. Amos felt his body sway with exhaustion, but every time he closed his eyes, he forced them open again. He watched her chest rise and fall, counted each shallow breath as if his will alone kept them coming. By dawn, pale light seeped through the window. The fever had not broken, but she was still alive. Amos stood stretching his aching limbs and stepped outside into the cool morning air. He filled his lungs with the scent of dew and dust. In the corral, his horse stamped and snorted, sensing his restlessness. Amos rubbed the animal's neck absently, his thoughts turning to the woman inside. He didn't know who she was or what story had left her abandoned to die in the desert, but he knew one thing with certainty: as long as she lay under his roof, she was his responsibility. Returning inside, he placed a log on the fire, stirred the coals back to life, and sat once more by her bedside. Eleanor moaned, turning her head on the pillow, whispering the name that had haunted the night. Silas. Amos's gray eyes hardened. He didn't know Silas, but the bitterness in her voice told him enough. There was a man out there who had chosen to leave her to die. And Amos Blackthorne, who had lived too long with silence, as his only company, found himself promising aloud, "Whoever you are, Silas, you won't touch her again. Not while I breathe." Morning slid into the cabin like a shy guest, pale and cool, and for the first time since the bite, Eleanor's skin no longer blazed. The fever ebbed the way a tide draws back from a ruined shore, leaving wreckage, yes, but also breath. She blinked at the rafters, at the golden band of light on the far wall, at the lazy twist of wood smoke curling from the hearth. The world felt scoured clean yet fragile, as if one wrong movement might shatter it again. A chair creaked beside her. "Easy," a low voice said, steady as winter timber. "Don't try to sit yet." She turned her head. The man from her delirium wasn't a fever dream. He was there, broad-shouldered, gray-eyed, sun-browned, the lines at his mouth, etched by work and weather more than by anger. He held a tin cup in both hands like it was an offering. "Water," he said. "Slow sips." Her throat worked before her mind could catch up. The first taste was almost painful in its sweetness. She sipped again, and a tremor ran through her arms, a small quake of relief. He tipped the cup back when she coughed and set it on the table. "My name's Amos Blackthorne," he said. "You're on my place." South line of the spur wash. Her voice rasped like wind through wire. She swallowed, finding her name as if it had been dragged out into the desert and left alongside the rest of her. "Eleanor." "Eleanor." "Hayes." She watched his eyes, a cautious experiment. Not Vance, not his name, her own. She waited for a flicker of judgment, a question. There was none. "Eleanor Hayes," he repeated, as if committing it to a ledger. "All right, Miss Hayes, you're safe here." He rose, moved with clean economy to the hearth, and ladled something from a pot. "Brothels sit better than beans," he said. "You lost a spell of days." "How?" "Long." She hated the way her voice scraped and broke. 3. "Fever near cooked you. You spoke some." He came back with a cracked bowl and a spoon that had been polished silver by use. "Here." He crouched one knee to the plank floor. "I won't crowd you. Tell me if it hurts." He didn't reach for her until she nodded. Even then, his touch was careful, not the grabbing, impatient handling she had braced for. He eased an arm behind her shoulders, lifting her against flattened pillows that smelled of cedar. Pain flowered hot in her ankle. She bit the inside of her cheek and forced it down. Slow, he reminded her, and held the spoon. She tried and learned that hunger can be as tender as a bruise. 2 spoonfuls, 3. The broth was thin and savory bone onion, a whisper of sage, and each swallow steadied the world a little more. Her gaze fell to her leg. A strip of white cloth bound her ankle, clean and snug. The swelling had deflated from monstrous to merely angry. Purple and yellow shadows marbled her shin where the heat had raged. "You cleaned it," she said. "And cut it," he admitted. "Old-timers' ways. They don't do as much as folks think, but sometimes they buy time. Didn't have better at hand. Kept you cool. Willow bark for the heat." He paused, studying her with that unflinching rancher's look that weighed weather and soil the same as souls. "You're alive. That's what counts." Alive! The word landed in her like a pebble in a well, ripples spreading. Alive meant choices. Alive meant tomorrow was not just a far bright line people talked about and never reached. She finished half the bowl, then shook her head. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were too small for what he had done, but they were all she had. He set the bowl down and lowered her back, careful not to jar her leg. "You can sleep more," he said. No. Her fingers brushed the coverlet, a fine hand-stitched quilt whose seams had been repaired recently with a thread that did not match. The stitches were not neat like a woman's. They were earnest crooked, a man's trial. If I sleep, I'll dream. I'd rather not. He pulled the rocking chair closer and sat. Then we can listen to the day go by, he said. It wasn't a jest, it was an offer. Silence lay easy between them for a time, broken by the small sounds of a place lived in fire, popping softly. A draft under the door. A magpie scolding from the cottonwood outside. She found she wanted to anchor herself to those sounds, to learn the names of each and keep them. Her eyes slid to the shelf above the hearth. There were jars with dried things, bark and leaves, and something that might have been comfrey. There was a Bible with a cracked spine. Beside it, a slim book with a pressed sprig caught under the cover. Was there someone, she asked, voice tentative, who kept a garden? His jaw moved once a slow acceptance. My wife, he said. Martha. He didn't look away. He didn't look toward the back corner where the bed sat either. He looked at Eleanor. She passed 5 winters back. I'm sorry. He nodded like a man receiving rain that he could not stop. She liked poems. I didn't understand half of them, but she read them to the kettle when it boiled, and to me when the nights got too long. He half smiled, a small thing that vanished as quickly as it appeared. You can read Miss Hayes. Yes, the answer warmed her. It was a small defiance to have held on to literacy through the battering years. She had kept it tucked away where no one could bruise it. Then you can borrow her book, if you want. His hand gestured toward the shelf, then fell back to the arm of the chair. He was careful again, offering without pressing. A thought trembled on her tongue and dissolved. Thank you seemed both too little and too much. She found safer ground. You said I spoke. What did I say? He folded his hands, fingers interlacing like he was settling a lariat. You said a name. Silas. The single word hit the air between them like a nail driven into wood. And some about a wagon. Broken axle. Heat. Her mouth went dry in a different way. Memory rose with the blackness that had crowded the edges of her sight under the pallow tree. The lurching shock of the strike, the hiss, the pain like stripped wire. Silas's shadow falling over her not to help, but to pluck the locket and pocket it. His mouth twisting, his boots turning away, his shoulders marching into the bright waist. He had not even hesitated. He had not even lied to himself or to her about mercy. I don't... She started, stopped. Not yet. I can't say it yet. You don't owe me telling, he said. Plain unornamented. You don't owe me anything. Something in her sagged with relief she hadn't known she was holding. Men always wanted the whole of a thing, the use and the story and the praise along with it. This one did not. That made her wary in a new way, the way you're wary of water. After you've been thirsted near dead, you sip, then you drink, and you wait to see if it holds. He stood. I'll tend to the stock. He pointed toward the shelf again. There's coffee if you think you can keep it. Little milk left. You try to move call out. I'll hear you. His mouth twitched almost wry. This old place tells me everything it doesn't want me to miss. When he stepped outside the cabin, exhaled. Eleanor let her head fall back and let the light walk across the wall. She listened to the sounds he made, bucket clanging, a low murmur to the horse, the creak of the well rope. The ordinary music of a place that worked. The ache in her ankle throbbed insistent. She shifted. A draft fingered the skin at her wrist where the blanket had slid, and she shivered. She wanted to see. She wanted to prove to herself that the door would be open if she leaned on it. Carefully, she swung her good leg toward the edge of the bed. The floor was cool. The injured ankle screamed when she slid it forward. She cradled it with both hands and breathed until the flare subsided. Inch by inch, she levered herself up. Her arms trembled, elbows locking. The room tilted, then righted. She stood. The victory was ridiculous and enormous. She clung to the bedpost, grinning at nothing, at the way the boards felt firm underfoot and not like the slanting clouds she'd been walking in for days. Miss Hayes, his voice said gently from the doorway, didn't we agree not to fall down today? She looked up, caught. He stood with the bucket in one hand and something like respect. No, not pity, Not indulgence, quiet acknowledgement in his eyes. He didn't rush to her. He set the bucket down. Permission, he asked. She nodded, and even that small consent felt like a reclaiming. He crossed the few steps and offered his forearm rather than a hand, a grip she could take or leave. She took it, fingers wrapping around corded muscle and sun-hardened skin, and let him steady her as she crab-walked along the bed to the chair. When she sank into it breathless, he crouched again to recheck the bandage. Still warm, but not like it was. "You'll keep it up," he said. He adjusted the pillow under her ankle as neatly as any nurse. "We'll get you stronger, inch at a time." "Why?" She surprised herself with the question. It leapt out raw. "Why did you do all this for a stranger?" He didn't answer right away, and when he did, he didn't turn it grand. "Found you where no one should be left," he said. "Didn't figure I had a choice I could live with." She learned something about him in that line, the way he measured his deeds against a standard that wasn't talk or town or law, but his own sleep at night. She nodded, blinking fast, forbidden tears begging. She would not cry in front of him. She had made a promise to herself the first night Silas called her useless. No more tears for men to feed on. But some tears weren't that kind. Some belonged to survival. She swallowed them back all the same. He fetched the slim book from the shelf and laid it in her lap. Martha liked the ones about fields, he said. And trains. Never rode one, but she liked the sound of them in words. Eleanor's fingers brushed the pressed sprig under the cover. She opened to a page and read a line aloud because the cabin seemed to ask for it. "The soul selects her own society." The words were like cool water under the tongue. She closed the book and held it against her ribs. He busied himself at the stove, set a blackened kettle to boil ground coffee with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The smell unfurled through the room and stitched itself into her memory of this hour. Light on the wall, the hum of the kettle, the promise of bitterness made good. "I should work," she said, and the old oath to usefulness tasted different. Not a plea, not a defense, just a want, something small. Mending, if you have it. He glanced at her, the faintest crinkle at the corner of his eye. "I got a drawer of shirts that thank you kindly." He wiped his hands on a towel and went to the chest. When he handed her the basket, she saw a tear in the front of her own dress had been sewn with those big stubborn stitches. She smoothed a finger over them. "You did this." "Couldn't let it keep tearing," he said. "It's good." She meant it. It was a hand held out across a river. He left her in the chair with the mending and poured 2 cups of coffee. He set one within reach and took the other to the door, leaning a shoulder against the frame, looking at the yard. "Fence on the north line's cranky," he said to the day. "Wind keeps throwing tricks." She threaded a needle. The quiet stretched companionable. She took the first stitch, then another. Outside, a magpie gave up its scolding and flew a black and white blade cutting the air. "You'll tell me when you want to," he said, still facing the light. He didn't say about what. He didn't need to. "Or you won't. Either way, I'll see you fed." Her throat closed. "I will," she said. "Just not today. Fair enough." The needle went in and out, the rhythm hypnotic. Eleanor watched the gap close under her hands, fabric finding itself again along a line that would never be invisible and didn't need to be. She felt something like that line stitching through her own chest. By afternoon, she could take 3 careful steps with his forearm for balance, and no more. He didn't count, didn't cheer. He just matched her pace, then settled her back with a pillow and a blanket folded at just the right height. He left space around her like a ring of stones around a small, stubborn fire. As the light shifted toward evening, she dozed without falling into the panicked dreams. When she woke, a plate waited with a heel of bread and a spoon of honey she did not ask him the price of. She ate it slow and felt strength lay down like a thin layer of clay on the riverbank after flood. He lit the lamp. The cabin glowed. She looked at him across the table littered with buttons and thread, and some of the words she had been hoarding came. "Amos?" she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said again, and this time the words fit the size of the room. He nodded. "You're welcome, Miss Hayes." Miss Hayes. Her name remade. The cabin held it, and the desert night for once did not press in so hard. She set the mending aside and folded the quilt higher over her shins. The window hummed with a soft wind. Somewhere a coyote lifted its voice and then thought better of it. Eleanor rested her head against the chair back and let her eyes drift. The last thing she saw was the book of poems, its pressed sprig, and the way Amos's shadow moved over the wall as he banked the fire solid. Careful there. In the morning, she told herself she would take 5 steps. And after that, she would learn the sound of this place by heart. By the time the second week bled into the third, Eleanor's steps were steadier. The swelling in her ankle had shrunk to a stubborn knot of angry color, but the pain no longer ruled her body. She could walk a slow circle around the cabin now, pausing to grip the table when her balance wavered. Amos let her try without fuss, only watching with that same unreadable patience, ready to steady her if she faltered. The rhythms of his life had absorbed her in quiet increments. At dawn, she woke to the scrape of a chair, the faint rattle of a kettle on iron, the groan of boots across the porch. He tended to stalk before the sun's fire grew merciless, checked fence lines returned by midday, with sweat darkening his shirt. She left behind took to small tasks, darning shirts from his drawer, sweeping the cabin floor, coaxing green shoots in the patch of soil outside the window where Martha's garden had once flourished. At first Amos protested when he saw her working. "You ought to be resting," he said, setting down the bundle of kindling he carried. "I've rested enough," she answered, smoothing her dress. Her stitches in his shirts were neater than his had been, the hem straight, the tears nearly invisible. "I can do this much." He regarded the shirt, then her, and gave a short nod. "Looks like you can." It was not praise, not dismissal, but recognition, and it warmed her in a way no words of Silas's ever had. Evenings were the strangest time and the gentlest. They ate together at the small table, meals simple but filling: beans, bread, stewed squash. Conversation was scarce, but silence no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a bridge, each breath shared across the table. One night Amos set a bowl in front of her and said, "Garden did better than I thought." She looked at the squash chunks floating in broth and smiled faintly. "I watered it, every morning." He grunted, but his eyes softened. "Then it's your harvest, not mine." The words clung to her long after the meal, sweeter than the squash itself. For so long she had been told she was a burden. Now for the first time something had grown under her hand, and it had been noticed. On the porch at dusk she sometimes sewed while Amos whittled wood curls of shavings piling at his boots. The sky would bruise violet and gold coyotes crying in the distance. Amos rarely spoke of himself, but every now and then something slipped past the guard. "My Martha," he said one evening, holding up a harness he had been repairing. "She thought I was too hard on leather, always said I was rough where patience would do." He paused, staring at the strap. She was right. Eleanor threaded her needle, careful to keep her voice soft. "Seems to me you're patient enough now." He gave a quiet huff that might have been a laugh. "Maybe I learned too late." The air between them stilled. Eleanor looked at the mending in her lap, then back at him. "Or maybe not too late," she said, and the words hung between them, fragile but real. Inside, in the dim light of the cabin, Amos sometimes left small signs of care she noticed only later. A shawl draped over the chair before the night chill set in. Her cup placed near the bed in case she woke thirsty. The old Bible moved to the side to make room for Martha's poetry book, where Eleanor had left it open. He never mentioned these gestures. Neither did she. But each one was a stitch in something larger, something she was beginning to recognize as safety. One morning she caught him outside repairing a gate latch. "Your stitches," she said, holding up his old mending. "They held even if they were crooked." He wiped sweat from his brow and glanced at her mouth, quirking. "So did you," he said. "Held even crooked." The word struck her deeper than he could have known. She turned away, blinking at the sky, her throat tightening. She had thought of herself as nothing more than bent broken. But to him, her survival itself was proof of strength. At night, when she lay on the cot, the cabin no longer felt foreign. It pulsed with the warmth of Amos's presence, with the slow creak of his chair by the fire, with the steady rhythm of a man who asked nothing of her but to heal. It was in that quiet that Eleanor realized something startling. She was not waiting for Silas anymore. She was not counting the horizon for his figure, not bracing for his voice. Instead, she listened for Amos's boots on the porch, for the scrape of his chair, for the kettle's hiss when he poured coffee. And with that realization came a tremor of fear, because safety was dangerous too. It let hope creep in, and hope was a fragile thing in a land that had nearly swallowed her whole. Still, when Amos came in from the yard one evening, dust clinging to his shirt, and nodded at her basket of mending with a simple, "Good work," she felt something shift inside her. A piece of herself once starved and forgotten had begun to breathe again. By the time the cicadas began their high-humming chorus in the evenings, Eleanor could walk without leaning on the table. Her gait was uneven, her ankles still stiff, but she no longer feared each step would betray her. Amos noticed he noticed everything, though he seldom spoke of it. He would glance once the way a rancher might glance at a fence line after a storm, assessing respectful, not intrusive. One afternoon she made it all the way to the porch on her own. The air outside was sharp with sun-baked sage, the yard stretching wide, dotted with the outlines of corral and barn. Amos was mending a harness strap at the porch rail, his hands slow and sure. She stood in the doorway watching him for a long moment before he looked up. "Well," he said, setting the strap aside, "seems you're getting along. I told myself I'd see the sky from here before the week ended." She lowered herself onto the step, breathless but proud. "Looks different than from the window." He nodded, settling back on his heels. "Windows lie. Make the world smaller than it is." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. She could feel the day's warmth seeping up from the boards, the rough grain beneath her palms. Somewhere beyond the barn, a hawk screamed. For the first time since the snakebite, she felt less like a body surviving and more like a woman living. She found ways to contribute small things at first. When Amos came in dusty from the fields, she had water waiting. When he left tools scattered, she gathered them into the crate near the wall. She even ventured into the small garden, kneeling carefully to coax weeds from between tender shoots. One morning, she found herself kneading dough in a bowl that had belonged to Martha, the sleeves of her dress rolled to her elbows. Amos walked in, stopped in the doorway, and stood silent for a moment. "I thought I'd try bread," she explained, wiping flour from her cheek. "If the yeast still holds." His mouth curved slightly. "Smells right already." When the loaf came from the oven imperfect and lopsided, he broke off a piece and tasted it. "Better than mine ever came," he said. And though his tone was plain, his eyes held something else, something warm, she hadn't seen directed at her in years. In the evenings, their silences shifted. They began to carry stories dropped like stones in still water. Eleanor told him of her childhood in Missouri, how her father's fiddle could make neighbors dance until dawn, how her mother had sewn the calico dress she still wore. She skipped over the darker years, the bruises left by Silas's words and hands, but even what little she shared made Amos's jaw tighten. For his part, Amos spoke sparingly of Martha. She liked to plant things where nothing ought to grow, he said one evening, eyes on the small patch of garden Eleanor had begun tending again. Said it was her way of arguing with the desert. Eleanor smiled faintly. "She sounds like someone I would have liked." "I think she'd have liked you," Amos replied, his voice low. Then he cleared his throat, turning back to the harness he was repairing, but the words lingered between them. Sometimes when the air grew cooler and the stars pricked the sky, Amos would sit on the porch step below hers. He didn't look at her, and she didn't look at him, but the silence they shared was no longer the emptiness of strangers. It was something that held something that grew. Eleanor began to notice the small ways he cared without speaking of it. A chair placed close enough to steady her if she faltered. A shawl folded neatly at the end of her cot. A line of chopped wood stacked higher than usual outside the door, as though he anticipated her need for warmth at night. And in turn, she began to care for him. She hemmed his shirts properly, replaced buttons, patched holes in his trousers. She found herself humming while she worked melodies half-remembered from her father's fiddle. When Amos walked past, he would pause not to interrupt but to listen. One afternoon, as she sat sewing on the porch, he returned from the field and stopped short. For a heartbeat, he just watched her, his face softened by something like memory. "My Martha," he said quietly, "could mend anything. Thought she could stitch the whole world back together with thread and patience." Eleanor looked up, meeting his gaze. The words had cracked something open in him, she realized. She smiled gently. Maybe she wasn't wrong. He sat down on the step below her. They didn't speak again for a long while, but the silence wasn't empty. It was shared, layered with trust that neither of them had dared to name. That night, as Eleanor lay in her cot, she realized something had shifted. She was no longer a guest, no longer simply surviving. She was becoming part of this place as surely as Amos was. And though her heart trembled at the thought, she knew one truth she no longer dreaded tomorrow. The days began to stack like neat cordwood, each one straighter than the last. Mornings brought the squeak of the well rope afternoons, the resin scent of hot sage evenings, a hush that settled on the porch like a quilt. Eleanor learned the house's quirks, the loose board that groaned by the stove, the latch that liked a firm hand and its small generosities too, the warm band of sun on the table, the way the cabin held heat long after the fire died. She kept herself busy. Work had always been the one language left to her when fear stole the rest. She washed plates with sand and lye-cut rags from worn shirts, coaxed beans and squash into Martha's garden patch. When wind lifted grit, she braced the fence with spare boards. When a hen wandered, she coaxed it back with crumbs, smiling despite herself. Amos led her. He never hovered, only stood close enough to catch her if she faltered. Most days, she didn't. The ankle still ached, but the pain felt more like a scar learning to be a limb again. At noon, they ate together at the window. Amos ate like a man raised by work, quiet, no waste, always thanking her, even if it was only beans and bread. Sometimes when she looked up suddenly, she caught him watching her hands, as though they were doing something he had long missed. Stories slipped into their silences. Peeling potatoes, she once said, "My father could make a fiddle sound like river water. Folks danced till lanterns gave out. I sewed in the corner, pretending my needle kept time." "You still do," Amos said from his harness, not looking up. "Keep time." She stilled. She had been called useless so often that truth felt foreign. Yet here it was spoken plain. Later he offered his own met Martha at a church picnic I hadn't planned for. Horse threw a shoe. She brought me fried chicken and a biscuit too light for the plate. Looked at me like she already knew the shape of my stubborn. Eleanor laughed, quick and startled. Amos looked up, not grinning, just content as if he'd tugged a thread that made good sound. Not all hours were easy. Sometimes a door catching would make her blood run cold. Sometimes she woke to the hiss of a phantom rattle chest heaving. Amos would rise from the chair by the hearth. He still gave her the bed, sit near, and say, "Breathe with me." He never pressed her to explain, just matched her breath until the terror ebbed. "Being afraid and being alive don't part clean," he told her once. "You're allowed both." The word allowed undid a knot she hadn't known she carried. The garden thrived under her hand. "They listened to you," Amos said, squinting at the bean sprouts. "Never did for me." "They already pay me back," she replied. Cooking became her offering. Bread gave way to biscuits, then pie from the sour apples Amos had traded salt for. The first crust collapsed, but he ate it cheerfully. "I've done worse by my own hand." The second came out golden and flaky, and he tapped his spoon once on the table, an Amos kind of applause. He taught her, too. How to oil a saddle, check hooves, carry a bucket with her hip. She learned to hear the difference between wind and cottonwood and the hush of a rider coming quiet. Each time she got it right, he said only, "There you go," and it lightened the task. Evenings often ended with her reading Martha's book of poems. She chose lines at random, letting them change the room. "The soul selects her own society," she read one night. Amos lifted his head. "Seems that's how it should be," he said, and she closed the book feeling the truth of it. Bits of her own story slipped out. Missouri creaks like hammered tin, a sister back east, a locket with her mother's hair. She stopped there, words closing over like water. Amos didn't pry. His silence said he'd wait. Once after she burned a biscuit, she began, "I'm sore." He cut in, almost puzzled. "For what?" It wasn't a trick. It made her stop and reconsider. She began practicing something new, not apology, but correction. It was clumsy, but it held. On a hot Sunday, they set work aside. Amos whittled pine on the porch while she mended a shirt. Doves muttered in the cottonwood. "Where would you go?" he asked after a long pause. "If you could just go." She surprised herself with the clarity. "A creek to cool my feet, then a town with ribbon by the yard and paper that doesn't smear, then a bluff where I could see farther than a day's walk." "You—" He shaved a curl of wood, used to dream of the ocean. Lately I think of staying but making the staying different. With someone else's footsteps on these boards, with laughter a man doesn't make alone. The words opened a room between them. Neither stepped into it, but neither closed the door. That night as the sky bruised purple, she stood in the doorway, hands braced. After I was bitten, she said, voice steady. He looked at me, took the water, and walked away. Amos's face did not flinch. He simply lifted his chin, meeting her truth head on. Tomorrow, she added. I can say the rest. I'll be here tomorrow, he answered. For the first time since the desert, her hand let go of the doorframe without shaking. The next day dawned with a sky so clear it felt almost cruel. A sweep of blue stretched over the desert like it had never known suffering. Eleanor sat on the porch steps, a shawl wrapped loosely around her shoulders, though the morning already burned warm. Her ankle rested on a stool, the bandages clean. She held Martha's book in her lap, but the page blurred. She hadn't told the whole truth yet, and it pressed at her now, a weight she could no longer carry alone. Amos emerged from the barn, sleeves rolled up, the smell of leather and horse clinging to him. He wiped his hands on a rag and paused when he saw her face. He didn't ask. He only came to sit on the step below hers, looking out toward the shimmering line of horizon. He left me, she said suddenly before the moment escaped her. Her voice trembled, then steadied. Silas, my husband, the snake bit me. And he looked down at me, smiled, and walked away. Took the water, took my locket, said I was a curse. The words spilled out harsh, jagged things she had kept caged too long. For a breath silence held. Then Amos said, I figured as much. His tone was flat dangerous, a low growl of thunder before rain. I kept thinking maybe he panicked, maybe he thought I was already gone. Eleanor's hands twisted in the shawl. But I saw his eyes. He wanted it, wanted me gone. Amos's jaw clenched. He turned to face her, his gray eyes hard as stone. Some men aren't men at all. They're cowards in boots. Eleanor swallowed a sob catching in her throat, but no tears came. She had none left for Silas. I thought dying there would be easier than this, than speaking it out loud. You're not dying, Amos said firmly. Not while I've got breath, and you don't owe that man another drop of your silence. The conviction in his voice startled her. It wasn't a vow dressed in flowers. It was plain immovable. He would not let Silas touch her again, and for the first time she believed it. She leaned back against the porch post, letting the words settle in her bones. The land around them stretched wide, indifferent and vast, but here in this small corner she felt anchored. Through the weeks that followed, their lives wove closer. Amos rose with the sun, and Eleanor began rising with him. She fed the hens while he tended cattle. She kneaded bread while he split wood. Their words were few, but their hands moved in rhythm, two lives stitched into one pattern without needing to speak it. One evening, she cooked a stew with beans, carrots, and the first tender greens from the garden. Amos ate slowly, then set his spoon down. Best I've had in years, he said. Better than Martha's, she teased gently, surprising herself. He gave a faint smile. Martha's was good. Yours has fight in it. The compliment struck her deeper than he knew. For years she had been told she spoiled food, spoiled plans, spoiled a man's life. To be told she put fight into something, it was a kind of absolution. On another evening, as dusk painted the sky violet, she stood with him outside the barn. The air was sharp with hay and horse sweat. She gathered her courage. I don't know what comes next, Amos. I've nowhere to go. No family close enough. No place that wants me. His gaze fixed on the horizon, jaw tight. Then you'll stay here, if you want. Nobody'll run you off, not while I'm standing. She turned toward him, startled by the finality in his tone. It wasn't a romantic declaration. It was a promise rooted deeper than words. The next morning she woke to find a clean, folded dress laid at the foot of her cot. Amos didn't mention it, but she recognized the fabric. It had been Martha's, tucked away in a chest. Eleanor hesitated, fingers brushing the worn cotton. It was more than a dress. It was trust passed from one life to another. When she stepped onto the porch wearing it, Amos only looked once. His eyes softened, but he said nothing. That silence was more profound than any compliment. The desert had tried to claim her. Silas had tried to abandon her, but here beside Amos Blackthorne, Eleanor felt something bloom that had no name yet. safety perhaps, or the fragile beginning of hope. And though the horizon stretched wide with threats she could not yet see, one truth settled steady in her chest: she would never again face them alone. The weeks that followed moved like a slow, steady river. The edge of fear that had once sharpened every hour of Eleanor's life dulled into something softer, routine safety, the steady pulse of a place where no one raised their voice or their hand against her. She found herself humming as she swept the floor, singing low as she worked in the garden. Sometimes she caught Amos listening from the doorway, leaning his shoulder against the frame, his face unreadable but his eyes quieter than she had ever seen them. Together they began to settle into a rhythm that belonged to neither his solitude nor her survival, but to the two of them joined. Eleanor baked more bread, each loaf better than the last. She traded her needlework for the heft of buckets, learning how to carry water without spilling it, how to salt meat the way Amos showed her how to stack wood so it would keep dry when the rains came. One evening, Amos came in from the fields, his shirt clinging damp with sweat dust clinging to his boots. Eleanor was bent over the stove stirring beans. He paused watching her, then said quietly, "You're making this place more than it was." She looked up, startled. "It was already yours." "I only mend a little, cook a little." He shook his head, setting his hat on the peg. "No, you breathe into it. Makes it feel alive again." Her throat tightened at that, the spoon trembling in her hand. It had been so long since anyone had said her presence added to anything rather than spoiled it. She turned back to the pot, hiding the tears that threatened, but Amos saw the way her shoulders shook. He didn't press. He only set the table with care, as if that act alone could steady her. At night, when the air cooled, they sat on the porch and watched the sky bruise with stars. Eleanor read poems aloud from Martha's book, her voice gaining strength with each line. Amos listened, eyes fixed on the horizon, his silence speaking volumes. Once when she finished a verse about endurance, he said softly, "Fits you that one." She had no reply, only closed the book and held it against her heart. Their bond deepened in gestures more than words. Amos built her a small stool so she could tend the garden without straining her ankle. Eleanor mended his work gloves with such fine stitches that he held them up in the light, surprised. He brought her wildflowers once awkwardly set in a chipped mug on the table. She never asked where he'd found them. She only smiled, touched the petals, and let the silence between them glow with meaning. Sometimes she thought of Silas, not with longing, but with a cold, clear hatred. The memory of his back turning away from her in the desert would strike her at odd moments. She would stiffen breath shallow, and Amos would notice. He wouldn't ask, but he would find some task to do nearby, his steady presence anchoring her until the storm passed. One night, as they sat by the fire, Eleanor finally said it aloud. "He'll come back for me." Amos looked up from the leather strap he was oiling. His gray eyes burned steady. "Then he'll find he came too late." The words struck like a hammer, plain, unflinching, protective. For a long moment, Eleanor stared at him, her chest tight. Then she nodded. She believed him. Slowly, laughter began to return to her. The first time it startled them both. She had been scolding a hen that pecked her apron, and when the bird flapped away in a huff, a bright laugh escaped her. Amos froze, then gave the faintest smile a crack in stone. "Sound carries nice," he said, and Eleanor laughed again softer, realizing it had been years since anyone told her joy had weight. The ranch had become more than shelter. It had become sanctuary. And in Amos's steady company, Eleanor discovered a truth she had never known. Love did not need to shout, did not need to bruise. Sometimes it was a quiet man standing by a fence, watching the sunset, waiting without demand. She still feared the horizon, but she no longer feared the night. And when she woke in the dark and heard the steady creak of Amos's chair by the fire, she knew whatever storm might rise, she would not weather it alone. It was a still hot afternoon when the peace fractured. Amos was in the barn oiling the hinges of the big gate, and Eleanor was on the porch shelling beans into a wooden bowl. The air carried the dry smell of dust, the lazy drone of insects, the kind of silence she had come to know as safety. Then she noticed a faint line of dust on the horizon rising like smoke. She shaded her eyes, her stomach tightening. A buggy. She could see the glint of wheels, the jerky rhythm of horses pulling fast. Visitors were rare in these parts. Unannounced ones were never good. "Amos." She called her voice low but urgent. He came quickly, wiping his hands on a rag, his body stiffening as he followed her gaze. The color in his face hardened. "Stay inside," he said, voice flat. "No," she whispered, clutching the edge of the porch rail. "I need to see." The buggy grew closer, dust pluming behind it until shapes sharpened in the glare. 2 men. The driver was Sheriff Tompkins, broad-shouldered with his familiar badge glinting. She recognized him from a distant memory, Jericho's sheriff, the nearest town east. But it was the man sitting beside him who made her blood freeze. Silas. Her breath caught like a snare pulled tight. He was cleaner now, fed his shirt new, his hat broad and smug on his head. The sight of him alive and whole felt like a cruel trick. He leaned back in the seat, his lips twisted in that practiced smile, the one he had once used to charm strangers and deceive her. Amos stepped forward, his body a wall. His hand brushed the butt of his Colt, though he didn't draw it. His gray eyes narrowed, watching. The buggy rattled to a stop in front of the cabin. Sheriff Tompkins climbed down first, tipping his hat. "Afternoon, Amos," he said. His eyes flickered to Eleanor on the porch, confusion knitting his brow. Silas dismounted with a flourish, dusting himself off. "Eleanor." "My love, my darling wife." His voice rang out like he was performing on a stage. "Thank God you are safe. I've searched weeks for you, fearing the worst." Eleanor's knees weakened. She gripped the porch post, the wooden beam grounding her. Behind the syrup of his voice, she saw it again, the desert sun on his back as he walked away, the locket glinting in his hand, the last of the water slung across his shoulder. "Stay where you are," Amos said, his voice low and sharp, each word like iron hammered flat. Silas's smile tightened. "Mr. Blackthorne, I am in your debt. You have done me the greatest service by saving my wife. As I told the sheriff, I was attacked by Apaches, knocked senseless. When I awoke, our wagon was gone. Eleanor was gone. I thought her dead." His performance was smooth, practiced, his tone rich with false sorrow. Sheriff Tompkins shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between them. "Now, Miss Hayes or Mrs. Vance, I reckon you understand this is mighty serious. Your husband here registered you deceased, looked broken up over it too." "He's lying." Eleanor said, her voice steady, though her heart hammered. "There were no Apaches. He saw me bitten by a rattlesnake and left me to die." The sheriff's eyes widened, his mustache twitched. "Now, ma'am, that's a grave accusation." Silas lifted his hands in mock disbelief. "You see, she is confused, fevered still. This man," he gestured toward Amos, sneering, "he has filled her head with tales. She is my wife. By law, she belongs with me, and I am here to take her home." Amos took one step forward, planting himself firmly at the base of the porch steps. His frame was unmoving, shoulders squared, his presence alone, radiating warning. "She's not going anywhere with you," he said, his voice cutting through the hot stillness. The air snapped tight between them. The sheriff glanced from one man to the other, the weight of the moment heavy in his eyes. Eleanor's breath came shallow, her fingers digging into the wood. She had feared this moment for weeks, and now it was here. Silas's charm cracked his eyes, narrowing his face, twisting. "She is mine," he snarled. "By law, by vows, you cannot keep her from me." Amos's jaw tightened, his voice a dangerous whisper. "Law doesn't give a man the right to leave his wife for buzzard food." The line was drawn. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the clash. The silence stretched heavy as the desert heat. Sheriff Tompkins tugged at his collar, sweat glistening under the brim of his hat. His eyes flickered between the 2 men, the steady rancher planted like a stone at the foot of the porch, and the slick-tongued husband whose smile had already begun to fray. Silas broke first. He raised his hands like a preacher at a revival. "Sheriff, you see the situation. My wife is confused, sick from fever. She thinks I abandoned her when the truth is I fought tooth and nail to find her. I went to every homestead within 20 miles. I prayed. I feared I'd never see her again." His voice softened, dripping false devotion. "Eleanor, darling, come down from there. Let me take you home." Eleanor's stomach twisted. The gall of it, his audacity to stand before her spouting lies so easily, he almost sounded convincing. For years she had lived under that voice, bent herself into knots to appease it. But something had changed. She had been left to die. And she had survived. No, she said. The word rang sharp and clean. She stepped forward onto the porch rail, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. You didn't search. You didn't pray. You stole my locket and my water and left me bleeding in the dirt. Sheriff Tompkins shifted, clearly unsettled. Mrs. Vance, that's mighty serious talk. Silas's smile faltered. A vein pulsed at his temple. She doesn't know what she's saying. The venom addled her mind. He turned toward Amos, jabbing a finger. This man has filled her with poison of his own, sheriff. He covets what belongs to me. Amos didn't flinch. His voice was low even, but it carried more weight than Silas's shouts. I covet nothing. She's here because she chose to stay. And she's not yours, not anymore. The sheriff's brows furrowed. By law! By law! Eleanor cut in her voice, ringing louder than she thought possible. Does the law account for a man who steals from his dying wife? Does it account for a man who calls her a curse, who spits on his vows and leaves her for the vultures? Her chest rose and fell, breath ragged but steady. Ask him where my mother's locket is. The words hit like a bullet. Silas's face blanched, then darkened. That trinket gone, lost when the wagon broke. Eleanor's eyes burned. No. You took it from my apron pocket while I begged for your help. Sheriff, look at his coat. He carries it still. Sheriff Tompkins blinked unsettled gaze darting toward Silas's breast pocket. Silas's composure shattered. You're raving woman, he snapped, his mask of civility cracking. I should never have come for you. He lunged forward, boot hitting the first porch step, arm reaching for her. But Amos moved quicker. He stepped in front of Eleanor, his broad frame a wall of flesh and fury. His hand didn't go to the revolver. It didn't need to. His presence alone stopped Silas short. That's far enough, Amos said, voice quiet, steady as stone. The sheriff's hand hovered near his own holster, his eyes darting nervously. Gentlemen, Silas sneered, you think you can keep her from me? She's my wife, my property. No ranch hand drifter will. Amos cut him off, steel in his tone. You're not man enough to keep her, Vance, not when you left her for dead. Eleanor's chest heaved, her hand gripping the porch post for balance. For years she had trembled before Silas's temper swallowed every cruel word bent under his shadow. But now she saw the truth laid bare. He was smaller than Amos, smaller even than her. All his bluster, all his charm was nothing but rot. Her voice rang out clear as a church bell. I will not go with you. The sheriff froze, eyes wide, caught between law and truth. The desert held its breath once more. And in that stillness, a battle of wills flared hotter than any gunfight. Eleanor's defiance against Silas's rage, Amos's silent strength against Silas's desperation. The moment teetered, ready to break. Silas's sneer curled into something uglier, his voice rising until it cracked. You think words make you free? You are my wife. Eleanor, the vows bind you. The law binds you. You belong with me, not squatting like some whore in another man's cabin. The word struck the porch like a whip, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She had lived under his venom too long, every insult and echo carved into her bones. Now standing in the doorway with Amos's steady shadow at her side, she realized the truth: his words had no power anymore. They bounced off her like stones thrown at a wall. Your vows died in the desert, she said, her voice calm, cold, unshakable. When you left me to the rattlesnakes and the sun, you killed them yourself. Sheriff Tompkins shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Vance, I'll remind you to keep a civil tongue. You're standing on another man's porch. Silas rounded on the sheriff. Civil. You think I came all this way to be lectured? She's my wife? The law? Eleanor's voice sliced through. The law cannot stitch flesh back together. The law cannot draw poison from blood. The law did not keep me alive. He did. She pointed to Amos, her hand steady. And if you dare say I belong to anyone, know this: I choose where I stand, and I will never stand beside you again. Silas's face flushed crimson rage, overtaking his slick facade. He reached toward his pocket fingers, fumbling at the outline of something small and metallic. Eleanor's breath caught. The locket. She knew it in her bones. There, she cried, her voice breaking sharp. Sheriff, the locket's in his coat. The sheriff's eyes snapped to the pocket. Mr. Vance, he said slowly, his voice tightening. Best show me what you're carrying. Silas's snarl twisted, but his hand stayed frozen over the pocket. It's nothing. A coin. A trinket. Then show me. The sheriff's tone sharpened. His hand hovered near his own holster. Amos didn't move, didn't need to. His presence loomed like bedrock, silent but unyielding. Eleanor felt the heat of him at her back, and her fear melted into fury. You robbed me as I begged you, she said, her voice rising. You stole from me while deciding I wasn't worth saving. Do you deny it now in front of God and law? The sheriff's jaw tightened. Mr. Vance, if what she says is true, that's theft. And fraud too if you filed her dead. Silas's mask slipped further, desperation twisting his features. She's delirious venom in her brain. She doesn't know what she says. This blackthorn has poisoned her mind against me. She doesn't need me to tell her the truth. Amos finally spoke, his voice low, almost quiet. She lived it. You can spin lies till you choke, but she's standing here alive because she chose to fight. You left her. I found her. That's the only truth worth anything. Silas lunged again, fury uncoiled. He shoved at Amos's chest, aiming to push past him onto the porch. But Amos didn't budge. The shove was like striking a wall. Amos's eyes blazed gray steel as his hand snapped out, gripping Silas's wrist before it reached Eleanor. That's enough, Amos growled. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried finality that chilled the air. Sheriff Tompkins stepped forward, his face set now. Mr. Vance, you're under suspicion of fraud and possible attempted murder. You'll come with me. Silas jerked against Amos's grip, spitting curses, but Amos held him steady, unshaken. Eleanor stood tall, her chest rising and falling, every nerve alight. For years she had been the one held down, silenced, diminished. Now she watched Silas writhing in the grip of a man who had nothing to prove, nothing to gain, only truth at his back. And for the first time she felt the power of her own voice. The porch felt like a courtroom, the desert itself serving as judge. Silas twisted in Amos's grip, his face mottled red veins standing out in his neck. Unhand me, you bastard. She is mine by law, mine by vow. His words were spit and fury flecks of it clinging to his lips. Amos's grip on his wrist tightened, but his tone stayed calm, almost quiet. The only thing you own is your own shame, Vance, and it's written all over you. Eleanor stood just behind Amos, one hand pressed to the porch rail, the other gripping her shawl. She had trembled under Silas's rage too many times to count, but tonight she did not tremble. She felt Amos's presence like a wall between her and every cruelty Silas had ever hurled. The strength in that silence gave her courage. Sheriff Tompkins pulled out a pair of worn iron cuffs from his belt. His hand shook slightly, but his voice steadied. That'll do. Amos let him go. Mr. Vance, you're coming with me. Fraud's no small matter, and this talk of abandoning your wife to die well, the judge in Jericho will want a word. Silas barked a laugh, but there was no humor in it. Fraud? Attempted murder. You'd take her word against mine. I'm her husband. She's fever-addled. Don't you see? Eleanor's voice rang out sharp and unwavering. I am not fevered. I am not broken. I watched you walk away while venom burned in my blood. You left me, Silas Vance. You stole my locket, and you stole my last chance at life. And now you stand here and dare to call me yours. Her words cut through the hot air like a whip crack. Silas's mouth worked, but no sound came. Amos shoved him once hard enough to send him stumbling down off the porch and into the dust. The sheriff moved fast, clapping the irons over his wrists before Silas could recover. You can curse me later, Tompkins muttered, snapping the cuffs shut. Right now you're bound for Jericho. Silas roared, straining against the cuffs, his face twisted with rage. You'll regret this, Eleanor. You'll regret the day you spat on your vows. You think this rancher can protect you. He's nothing. Nothing but dust and silence, and you... He turned his glare on Amos, his voice venomous. You'll die alone like your wife did. The insult struck low, but Amos did not flinch. His jaw tightened, his hand twitching once toward the Colt at his side, but he did not draw. his eyes cold and gray as winter steel locked on Silas. "Get him out of here, Sheriff, before I change my mind about letting the law handle him." Sheriff Tompkins yanked Silas toward the buggy. Silas struggled, cursing his voice, carrying down the dry road. But with each step, his fury sounded less like power and more like desperation. The dust swallowed his words as the buggy wheels turned, carrying him away. The desert fell silent again. Only the cicadas buzzed steady and low. Eleanor sagged against the porch post, her knees giving way. Amos turned at once, steadying her with a hand on her arm. His touch was firm but careful, like always. "Easy now." Her breath shook. "He's gone." Amos nodded. "He's gone." For a long moment, she simply breathed the air, filling her lungs like water filling a dry well. Then, to her own surprise, she laughed softly. It was a fragile laugh, threaded with relief and disbelief, but it was hers. "He can't hurt me anymore," she whispered, as if saying it aloud might make it truer. Amos's gaze softened the steel in his eyes, giving way to something gentler. "No, he won't. Not while I draw breath." Eleanor met his eyes steady and unflinching. For years, Silas had broken her with his words. Tonight, Amos had rebuilt her with his silence, and in that silence she found her strength. The buggy rumbled down the road, its wheels creaking until the sound thinned into the desert air. Silas's curses faded like the dying echo of a coyote howl. The land seemed to exhale when he was gone, a hot wind sweeping across the yard and scattering the last of the dust he had stirred. Eleanor stood on the porch, trembling but upright. The shawl had slipped from her shoulders. She didn't bother to fix it. Her chest rose and fell as though she had run miles, but her eyes were steady. She had spoken the truth at last, and the truth had stood. Amos lingered beside her, arms crossed, gaze still fixed on the horizon where the buggy had disappeared. The lines at the corners of his eyes were carved deep, harder than she had ever seen them. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, without turning, he said, "He won't be back soon. Sheriff will see to that." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Do you think he'll hang for it?" Amos shook his head slowly. "Men like him are slick. They wriggle out of nooses better than most snakes. But fraud, false death report, might keep him behind bars long enough for him to learn the taste of his own fear." His voice dropped cold and flat. "And if he ever comes here again, it won't be the sheriff taking him away next time." The weight of his words settled into the boards beneath their feet. Eleanor looked at him, really looked at the square set of his shoulders, the vein pulsing in his temple, the quiet rage burning under his calm. He had promised protection, and she believed him. But more than that, she saw something else. A man who had chosen her safety, not out of duty, but because he wanted it. Her knees weakened, and she sank onto the porch step. Amos lowered himself beside her, his hat in his hands. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence born of storms past when the air is raw and cleansed. "I thought I'd die in that desert," Eleanor said softly. "When I saw him walking away, I thought, that was it. That was the end." Amos turned his hat slowly between his hands. But it wasn't. "No," she whispered, a small, fierce light flaring in her chest. It wasn't. She pressed her palms to her lap, staring down at her fingers stronger now, calloused from work, stained with earth from the garden. These were not the hands of the woman Silas had abandoned. These were the hands of someone new. She felt Amos shift beside her. He didn't reach for her, but his presence filled the space like an anchor. "You're stronger than you think, Eleanor," he said. Her head turned sharply, her eyes searching his. "How do you know?" "Because you're here," he answered simply. "After all he did, after all the desert tried, you're still here." The words washed through her like cool water, steady and unadorned. She swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in her eyes. "I don't feel strong. I feel empty." "That's how it starts," Amos said. "Empty leaves room for what's worth filling." They sat in quiet, the sun dropping lower, painting the desert in long bruised shadows. From the barn, a horse snorted, restless after the commotion. The wind picked up, tugging gently at Eleanor's hair. She closed her eyes and let it touch her face. At last she whispered, "Thank you, Amos, for standing between us. His gray eyes softened, though his mouth remained firm. I didn't stand between. I stood with. That's different. Her lips parted, but no words came. She had no language for the thing unfurling inside her, something fragile, something she feared naming lest it vanish. She only knew this Silas's shadow had finally lifted, and in its place was a man who had guarded her, not with chains or vows, but with choice. When the stars pricked the sky that night, Eleanor lay on her cot and listened to the slow creak of Amos's chair by the fire. Each sound, the rasp of his breath, the steady tick of the clock, was a promise that the silence no longer belonged to her fears. For the first time in years, she slept without dreaming of snakes. The next morning dawned softer, as though the desert itself had turned a page. A pale haze lingered above the horizon, and the air carried a coolness Eleanor had not felt in weeks. She rose slowly, leaning on the wall for balance, and stepped out onto the porch. The boards were cool under her bare feet, and for once she did not feel the weight of dread pressing down on her shoulders. Amos was already in the yard, carrying buckets from the well. His movements were steady, unhurried, but she could see the tightness in his jaw. Yesterday's encounter had left its mark on him as surely as it had on her. He set the buckets down, wiped his brow with the back of his arm, and looked up. "You should be resting," he said. "I've done nothing but rest," she replied, her voice firm but soft. "I want to feel the day." He studied her for a moment, then nodded as though he understood she wasn't speaking of her body, but of her spirit. He walked over boots crunching in the dirt and sat on the porch step beside her. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't heavy. It was the kind that follows a storm, when the earth itself seems stunned by survival. Then Eleanor exhaled her breath, shuddering. "It's over, isn't it? Truly over." Amos leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "It's over." His voice was plain sure. "He won't be back soon, not with irons on his wrists. And if the sheriff does his duty, he won't be back at all." She closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. Relief flooded her body so profound it left her weak. Her hands knotted together in her lap loosened. For years she had lived as though every dawn might bring Silas's anger. Now for the first time, dawn brought nothing but light. Her breath caught suddenly, and to her surprise she laughed, short, shaky, but true. "I thought I'd never see the day, that I'd always belong to his shadow." Amos turned his head, his eyes softening at the sound. "You don't belong to any shadow." The word struck her with quiet force. She looked at him, really looked, the lines carved deep around his eyes, the gray threaded in his beard, the way his gaze held hers without demand or judgment. He had stood between her and death not once but many times now. And still he asked nothing from her but to keep breathing. Her throat tightened. "I don't know how to begin again," she admitted. "You already have," he said simply. "Every loaf of bread, every stitch, every step you take outside that door, it's beginning." She blinked back tears, not of sorrow, but of something she scarcely recognized, gratitude, freedom, the fragile bloom of hope. She looked down at her hands, no longer trembling, and whispered, "Thank you." He nodded as if her thanks belonged not to him alone, but to the land, the sky, the steady pulse of survival itself. The day stretched gently ahead. Eleanor moved through it lighter than before. She tended the garden, her fingers deep in the soil, relishing the feel of earth that welcomed her touch. She scrubbed the table, humming under her breath. She even took a walk to the cottonwood tree, Amos's steady figure, trailing a few paces behind, silent but watchful. When evening came, they sat side by side on the porch, watching the sky bruise with twilight. Eleanor leaned back against the post, her body tired but whole. She glanced at Amos. His gaze was on the horizon, but his presence was fixed on her, solid and certain. The truth came unbidden, quiet but undeniable. She was free. Truly, wholly free. And freedom, she realized, wasn't just the absence of Silas. It was the presence of Amos, the man who had never asked her to kneel, only to stand. The cicadas sang, the stars kindled, and for the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine a future. The following days unfolded with a gentleness that felt almost foreign to Eleanor. Morning sun slipped through the window, lighting the cabin in warm bands of gold. She rose without dread in her chest, her movements no longer shadowed by the weight of a man's anger. Every task she did, washing a dish, watering the garden, folding Amos's shirts, was a reminder that she was alive and that her choices belonged to her alone. Amos, too, had shifted. He still spoke little, but there was a looseness in his shoulders, a softening in the way his voice carried across the small cabin. When he returned from the fields, he lingered a little longer by the door before stepping inside as if savoring the comfort waiting there. He did not say it, but Eleanor felt it. The ranch no longer carried only Martha's ghost. It carried the steady heartbeat of two people bound by something new. One evening, Eleanor stood by the stove stirring a pot of stew. Amos sat at the table carving wood with his knife shavings curling onto the floor. The fire crackled, throwing light across his face. She glanced at him, then back at the pot, gathering her courage. "I need to say it plain," she began, her voice low. "I have nowhere to go. No family that'll take me in. No home waiting." Amos's knife paused mid-cut. He didn't look up right away as if weighing the weight of her words. Then he set the wood down, folded his hands on the table, and lifted his gray eyes to hers. "I know," he said. She swallowed, fingers tightening on the spoon. "You've given me shelter, Amos. Food care protection. More than I ever thought I'd see again. But when I'm healed, when I'm strong, if you want me gone, I will go." Something flickered in his expression, sharp as flint. He stood moving to the stove. Gently he took the spoon from her hand and set it aside. Then he turned her to face him, his hand steady but careful on her arms. "Eleanor Hayes," he said, speaking her full name like a vow. "You don't need somewhere else to go. You're already home." Her breath caught her eyes stinging. No man had ever spoken to her like that, not with ownership, not with disdain, but with simple, unshakable truth. Her lips trembled. "Do you mean that I don't speak?" "What I don't mean," he answered. His voice was low but firm. "This land's hard. Life's harder, but it's better when two shoulders carry it. If you want to stay, then stay. Not as a burden, not as a shadow, as yourself." The silence after his words was thick with meaning. Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest where her heart pounded like a drum. For years she had been nothing but a possession, a curse, a weight dragged through dust and hunger. Now here she was, being offered something she had thought impossible, a place and the right to belong. Her voice cracked when she whispered, "Then I will stay." Amos's face softened, the hard lines easing into something almost tender. He released her arms slowly, as though afraid too much force might break the moment. Then he picked up the spoon again, stirred the stew, and said simply, "Good. Supper's ready." That night Eleanor lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, the words repeating in her mind. "You're already home." She pressed her palms together as though in prayer, though she wasn't sure who she prayed to anymore. Maybe to the desert itself for sparing her, maybe to Martha for leaving behind a man capable of such steadiness. In the chair by the fire, Amos shifted his silhouette, broad and quiet. For the first time since she had been left in the dust with venom in her veins, Eleanor closed her eyes without fear of waking to an empty world. She was not alone, and she would never be again. The days stretched long and golden, each one steadier than the last. Eleanor's ankle healed until she could walk without favoring it. Her steps confident across the porch, down the garden rows, even to the barn where Amos worked. She had thought healing meant only survival, but here in this quiet ranch she discovered it also meant living again. She and Amos moved in rhythm now, like a team that had worked side by side for years. In the morning she baked biscuits while he fetched water. By noon she hung laundry on the line, watching it billow like sails while he mended fences with deliberate precision. Evenings found them on the porch, watching the horizon fade, to fire the silence between them, rich with things neither yet dared to name. One afternoon Amos returned from the Northline dust, caking his boots, his shirt clinging to his back. Eleanor was kneeling in the garden, coaxing bean vines up the stakes. She looked up as he approached, shading her eyes. "You're pushing too hard in this heat," she said. "And you're not," he countered, nodding at the dirt smudged on her cheek. She laughed, brushing her hands against her apron. "Fair enough." He crouched beside her, resting his forearm on his knee, his gray eyes following the vines she tied. "Never thought I'd see this patch green again." "Plants are stubborn," she replied, her voice quiet. "They'll grow where they're given half a chance." His gaze lingered on her, and she felt it, the unspoken meaning layered beneath his words. Heat rushed to her cheeks, and she turned back to the garden, her fingers trembling slightly on the twine. That evening, when supper was cleared away, Amos lingered at the table. The lamplight softened his features, casting deep shadows across the planes of his face. He cleared his throat, a rough sound. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. Eleanor set her needlework aside, her heart quickening. "About what?" His thumb traced the rim of his mug. "About how long a man can live with silence before it swallows him whole. I thought 5 years was enough. I thought I'd had my share. But then you came." He looked up, his eyes steady gray and clear. "And the quiet isn't so heavy now." Her breath caught. She wanted to speak, to tell him what his presence meant, how his strength had rebuilt her from ashes. But the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she reached across the table, her hand hovering until it found his. His skin was rough, calloused, but his touch was gentle when his fingers curled slowly around hers. For a long moment, they simply sat that way. Hands joined the silence between them, deep and full. Outside, the night settled soft around the cabin. Crickets chirped and the cottonwood leaves whispered in the breeze. Amos rose, tugging her gently to the porch. Together they stood at the rail, watching the sky bleed from rose to indigo. Stars pricked the heavens one by one, bright against the vast dark. Eleanor leaned against the post, her hand still in his. For the first time, she let herself admit it to herself, to the night, to the steady man beside her. What she felt was not only gratitude. It was something deeper, something fiercer. It was love. And though the words stayed unspoken, she felt certain he knew. The weeks rolled into one another, carrying with them a steadiness Eleanor had once thought impossible. The land was harsh, the work unending, but in the rhythm of it all she found a peace she had never known in her former life. The scar on her ankle faded into a pale reminder of survival, and the deeper scars within her heart slowly softened under the weight of days filled with quiet companionship. One morning Amos saddled his horse early, preparing to ride into town for supplies. Eleanor stood on the porch, watching him tighten the cinch strap, his movements practiced and calm. She stepped closer, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "Don't be long," she said, her tone half playful, half anxious. Amos looked up, the corner of his mouth twitching into the faintest smile. "You planning to run off if I take too long?" "Not anymore," she replied, her voice firmer than she expected. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. "This is my place now." He studied her, his gray eyes holding hers until she felt as though he could see straight through to her soul. Then he nodded, satisfied. "Good. That's what I hoped you'd say." When he rode away, the dust trailing behind him, Eleanor turned back to the cabin. She looked at the porch, the garden, the cottonwood tree beyond the fence. It struck her then, with startling clarity, this land had once been nothing but a lonely stretch of survival for Amos. Now it was something more. It was theirs. That evening when Amos returned, he carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the table, cleared his throat, and gestured for her to open it. Inside was a simple dress, blue calico plain but carefully chosen. Eleanor's hands trembled as she held it up, her eyes wide. "I thought maybe you'd like something new," Amos said, his voice gruff. "Something that's yours alone." Her throat tightened. She had worn rags, cast-offs, hand-me-downs from a man who treated her like nothing. Now here was a gift not for necessity, but because she was seen, because she was worth it. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered, "Thank you." He shifted awkwardly as though uncertain what to do with her tears. "Don't thank me, just wear it." And she did. That Sunday she wore the dress as they walked to the small church in town together. The whispers followed them, as whispers always did, but Eleanor held her head high. She no longer felt like the abandoned woman left to die in the dust. She felt like someone reborn. Weeks later, on a quiet evening, Amos stood on the porch, the sky glowing with sunset. Eleanor joined him, her hand brushing his. He didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers twined with hers, rough and sure. "I don't say much," he said after a long pause, his voice carrying into the cooling air. "But I reckon you know what's in my heart." Eleanor's breath caught. She turned to him, her lips trembling into a smile. "I think I do." He looked at her then, and in his eyes, she saw everything words could not carry: the promise of protection, the weight of devotion, the quiet, steady fire of love. Eleanor leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder as the stars began to prick the sky. The land stretched before them wide and unyielding, but they faced it together. no longer alone, no longer afraid. Her cruel husband had left her for dead, but in his absence, she had found life hard, honest, and filled with hope. And in the arms of a lonely cowboy, she had found something even greater. She had found home. Your thoughts will help us create meaningful stories. And if you want to hear more powerful healing stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the bell icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And most importantly, share this video with people who need a little hope today. Thank you so much for your time. We hear you, we listen to you, and we are honored to tell these stories for you.